This morning we have a little bit more difficult of topics. Difficult because it's very near the heart, and in our society, in our lives, we deal with it a lot. And in Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus, remember, just contextually, starting at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, talking about what it means, to be blessed or happy or the poor in spirit, for there's the kingdom of heaven, right? The whole idea of heaven's values, right? The whole Sermon on the Mount is Jesus exposing the values of heaven. On earth, we say, if it feels good, do it. Take what you can, right? What was what's his name? The pirate guy from the movies from Disney. Jack Sparrow, take what you can and give nothing back or whatever, right? And that's kind of how this world operates, right? Get yours, make sure you're taken care of. And Jesus comes along and says, no. Here's the thing. There's a blessedness in being meek. Remember, meekness isn't weakness. It's the idea of reserved strength. And so the world says, take what you can. And Jesus comes along and says, no, if you want to inherit the world, have a legal right to possession, that comes through meekness, right? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So it's no different when he comes along and he kind of changes gears. And a couple weeks ago, I looked at murder. And he says, look, you've heard it said. And what he's doing is he's quoting the law and the Pharisees. And he says, you've heard it said that you shalt not murder. And he says, but I say to you, if a man hates his brother, then he's murdered him in his heart, right? And he goes on from there and talks about if you call him a fool. And he says, a person that insults his brother, it's an offense that's worthy of hell. Not a Christian that does it is going to hell, but it's an offense worthy of hell. And so he's establishing, and we can see that, right? And how many times have we heard a person say, well, I'm not a bad person, I've never killed someone. And again, I kind of always joke about it because it's funny to me. I'm not killing people, but the idea that that's our standard for being a good person. No one ever says I'm a good person. I've never gossiped because no one can. But it's just one of those things where we go, I've never killed someone. I'm not a bad person. And Jesus comes along and says, no, if you've insulted someone, if you've called them stupid, in the kingdom's estimation, that makes you worthy of being separated from God forever. And it really brings it home like, oh, man. Like there's not too many of us that can say I've never done that. And so he does these exposures that he's doing. And so this morning we're going to look at adultery and divorce because that's just where we are. And 53% of couples in the United States of America divorce, and that's the same number in the church as it is in the world. And for a lot of you, that's the hard part about this topic. I don't think the doctrine is as hard. But the fact that, unfortunately, divorce and adultery and these things, they incur or can incur a ton of shame. And a lot of times Christians are more than happy to heap shame on people for those things. And so really what we want to do this morning is I want to acknowledge, first of all, this is an incredibly difficult topic. And there's a lot of emotional involvement in it. And my hope is to kind of expound here what Jesus is saying throughout the rest of Scripture to see what is Jesus' point, what does it mean? Because the point is not to shame people. It's not to make sure that no matter what happens, forever you have to remain single if you've been divorced. It's not that God was like, you get one shot and after this, you get nothing. And unfortunately, a lot of times these things get communicated in that way. So to look at what's the truth, what's going on, what's happening, and how can we apply it today? Remember, he's talking, and first off, I want to look at the culture, just by reiteration. So he's talking in a culture, so during Jesus' day, when Jesus is walking around on the earth, there are kind of two major players in the Jewish community that have teachings on divorce. One is a guy named Rabbi Hillel, and his teaching in general was that you could divorce your wife for anything at all. You could give her, and the Greek there, and it's also echoed in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, is put her away. And that you could, if she did something that you didn't like, if she talked back to you, if she, whatever it is, just some sort of kind of chauvinist thing, that you could divorce her. And then there was another guy, and it was Rabbi Hamiel or Hami, I always forget, Hamel, anyway, Shammai, there you go. Ask Dave. You can talk to Shammai, and he would say no. He would quote Deuteronomy 24, and he would say, the only reason that you can divorce your wife or literally issue her a certificate of being put away is if she was unfaithful to you. Now, we know culturally, well, I shouldn't say culturally, we know that in the law, this was also available either way. So even though the law is written in kind of a male sense, oftentimes it's if a man is if the populace. So in the law, a woman could divorce her husband. It just wasn't exercised because for 3,500 years, you have a kind of a male-dominated world. And then the law comes along in 1500 BC. And the law, when I say the law, I mean the Levitical law. And then 40 years after that, the law from Deuteronomy, which was a little bit different because it was the law from Leviticus governed the people while they wandered, and the law in Deuteronomy governed the people once they would have a temple, a place to worship. And so in Levitical law, you see a much different heart from God. And this is what I really want to establish before we read these things. So God was saying one thing, and humans, including Jews, were doing another. This is super important because we don't want to take human behavior and human attitudes like Hillel, or as we'll see in a minute here, even the disciples, and say that's what God meant. Because it's not what he meant. And if you look in, for example, the law, like there's a bunch of ladies and her husband, they're widows. And they come to Moses and say, we're widows, we want our land though. We get to, our husbands are dead, but we want to take the land. And Moses is like, well, I don't know if you can do that. And he goes to God, and he goes to the tabernacle, and he says, God, should I give them the land? And says, yeah. God says, yeah, give the ladies the land. Which for us, we're like, well, of course. But in 1500 BC, where women are generally accepted as property, it was revolutionary. Where God is telling Moses, no, women can own land. So was it always that way? No. Did men mess that up? Sometimes, 100%. Moses has to go to God. He's like, I don't know if I could do that. God has to tell Moses, no, these ladies can own land. There's a really funny law that I think is just outstanding. It's one of my favorites. So for our culture, it's super weird. But in the Hebrew culture, you paid special attention to who your husband's brothers were. Because if your husband died and you didn't have children, it was your husband's brother's duty to have sex with you to impregnate you. Which we're like, whoa, no thank you. Or I don't know, maybe your husband's brother, I don't know. But it's just I probably shouldn't joke like that. But, in general, you're like, I chose the wrong one. So if your husband dies, it's his job. So there's actually a law. There's a law in the Levitical law that if your husband refuses and says, no, I'm not willing to, the wording is raise up seed to my brother. I'm not willing to give you a lineage, because that was really important. Lineage was important. It's how the land was passed down. It's how inheritance worked. Lineage was really important to God. And so if that brother said, no, I'm not willing to do that, as a woman, you could force him to come before the village elders of your village, and you would take your shoe off, you would spit in his face, you would slap him with your shoe, and you would say publicly, this man is unwilling to raise up seed to his brother. He's dishonoring his brother. Which again, in our modern society, you're like, I don't feel like that law is necessary. Like, I'm good. Like, I'll adopt. It's whatever. But in that sense, it gave women the right to publicly shame a man. Again, that's revolutionary. And you can go through the law, and you can see law after law after law where women were given ownership of land, authority for their autonomy, and insist on what a man was supposed to, they have the right to, all these things. So the reason I bring all that up is when you come to these verses, the things that we're going to read, a lot of times they get interpreted through what human beings have done and not through the heart of God. Does that make sense? And so what we want to approach it from is not from like what Rabbi Hillel says. We want to approach it from what does God say. We don't want to approach it from what men over the ages have taught or something like that, but what was God's heart? So God's heart is never anti-woman. Does that make sense? It's never oppression. It's never belittling. It's never less than. It's never any of that. It's pro-human, if you will. He loves human beings, right? And he loves women. And he loves men. And so there's a reason why he's laid out what he's laid out. And so that's what we want to explore today.